that my Wi-Fi has been glitching, but we can start. Hi everyone, my name is Michaela. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And today we are wrapping up Ask an Advocate series with Sydney Baruta, who works with ASTOP.
Hi everyone, glad to be here. Like Michaela said, my name's Sydney. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I have a background in business management. That's where I have my bachelor's and a minor in Spanish. Should I just keep on going through these questions, Michaela?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So the first question is, what does a victim or survivor advocate do? So all of the advocates at ASTOP are available to support clients in a variety of ways and places. So we will come in if we have a request for accompaniment at a hospital or at the police department, pretty much generally anywhere, schools too. So a couple of examples are for their SAAM exam, which is a sexual assault nurse exam, which is basically just making sure that the survivors are in good health after the assault and just checking in to get as much evidence as possible if they're willing to do that. We'll also go with them to report their sexual assault, which is typically at the police department, and we just sit there and essentially hold their hand, whether it's physically or just emotionally, as they, re-experience their trauma by telling it over and over again. For me, the biggest joys of working as an advocate have been seeing the growth of my clients. So just at the beginning, right after an assault, and I've been with a few of my clients from the get-go. And for some of them, it's difficult to eat, sleep, and just do basic hygiene things like shower. And they don't want to go to school or work, and all they can think about is what they experienced. And even a few months later, they're already telling me, oh yeah, I had a good meal the other day, and it's in passing. They don't really notice these milestones. And so the best part of my job is when they tell me, no, I feel like I'm not healing fast enough, or I need to fix myself. And I get to tell them, well, if you're looking at this reaction that you just had right now, how would you have reacted to the same incident, a month ago? And they're like, whoa, yeah, I guess I have, come a long way. And they just take a moment, and it's really inspiring to see how much they can grow in such a short amount of time. But there are definitely challenges. It's definitely frustrating to see there's a lack of understanding in the society, in just general society, for what people are going through when they go through a trauma. When somebody says that they've gone through, this big, terrible thing, people right away are going to say that they're sorry and they're sympathetic, but they don't realize oftentimes that the effects of trauma are really long term. They might be able to work on how they react to a trigger, but they can't just they can't just make those triggers just go away magically. They might be able to reduce how much it bothers them, but they're still going to be there for a long period of time. And sometimes people expect them to be okay after a month or two, and that's just not realistic. So for me to, combat these these challenges and things like that, I do a lot of self-care. I try to incorporate just general self-care throughout my day-to-day. One of the biggest things that I do is really just lean on my coworkers. Anytime I have a difficult experience and I am almost experiencing some secondhand trauma myself, I can go to my coworkers and just tell them what happened at this, report or whatever it was. And they'll just sit there and listen, and they're really good at listening. It's part of their job too. And then I also set some really clear boundaries. So for example, I'm a bilingual advocate. And when I have a client who is maybe asking, let's say I'm with a Spanish speaking client at court. sometimes the courts won't automatically provide an interpreter, and they ask that the client asks for an interpreter. And if they don't have an interpreter there, I'm expected to do the interpretation. And in the moment, I will do the interpretation because there's really no other option. But I make it clear to the court or whatever partners that we're working with that I'm not an interpreter, I'm an advocate. And if I'm being asked to interpret, I can't do my job as an advocate. So that's one of the big boundaries that I've really set for my role. And I also just make sure not to take any of it home. I live with my boyfriend. I don't really talk to him about what happens to me at work, because then I am having to re-explain all of it. And it's just not the same when you're talking to somebody who understands it, like one of your coworkers. And lastly, what can other people do to help and support victims and survivors is really just listen when somebody tells you their story. A lot of people, when they're sharing their story, they just want to be heard. They don't need you to tell them that they're sorry or that it was a bad thing that happened, because they know that they were there. Just let them know that you're grateful that they were able to get that information and that they were able to have the honor of hearing their story, and tell them that you believe them. Ask if there's anything that you can do for them. Maybe they are interested in reporting if they haven't, and they would like a friend there. You can totally go with them. You can get them in touch with our services and we can help them through that. But just ask what you can do. And if they say nothing, then that's it, just nothing. Your responsibility in that moment is to just let the awkward silence be.
Thank you. And then if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise their hand or put them in the chat. I do have a question. What advice would you give to someone who's interested in becoming a victim survivor advocate?
One thing that I would definitely say is to get involved with volunteering so that you can get kind of a small piece of what it's like. So we work with volunteers and they answer the crisis line or go to advocacy requests. And that will just give somebody some experience. And then whenever some place has an opening, just apply. You can definitely look online for a lot of like mental health resources and things like that to just kind of get your foot in and start understanding a little bit more of the world. But there's not a ton of specific prerequisites. Experience is always welcome, but as long as you've got the passion to help people, that's really what we look for. And then there's a question in the chat. Have courts or organizations been understanding and respectful of those boundaries you set, like interpretation and advocacy? What strategies have I used to reinforce those? So in some cases they are, in some cases they aren't. For interpretation specifically, that's one of the harder ones to work around. Versus the other one I mentioned is that I don't take any of it home. That's something that I can only control. But for saying that I'm an interpreter versus an advocate, that's something that is a little bit more hazy and people don't typically understand that right away. And it's very difficult to explain, at least for me, the differences between it. But when it comes down to it, I just tell them that this isn't my job. And they do respect that because they understand they can't force me to interpret. But there have been some places where they've not had the resources available in Spanish, which is very frustrating because then I do have to go in and like give them, translate or find similar resources because they don't really have any other way to do it. So it's complicated and it's definitely blurry, but I stick to my ground and they respect that in most places. I understand ASTOP pairs with local agencies. How do you feel law enforcement can better assist victims? What do you see that can be hazardous and what do you see can be more beneficial practices? Yeah, we pair with a ton of different community partners. Law enforcement is definitely one of the bigger partners that we have. I think that law enforcement just understanding that their job isn't to be an advocate. It's not to understand trauma, and they don't really get trained very specifically on how to work with sexual assault victims. So just knowing what they're able to do and what they're not able to do, and being open to having an advocate there with the victim so that we're able to step in where we can. And things that I see that can be hazardous is sometimes they'll step forward and they'll try to do the comforting. And like one thing that they might say is like, you're safe now, or it's okay, which might not be true for a victim. They might be safe in that moment, like specifically, but if they return back home, they might not feel safe still. And they might not feel safe even in that moment. So just sometimes having that, it's just a little bit difficult to be there for victims in that capacity when you're not fully aware of what the trauma responses are and things like that. And beneficial practices would definitely be just working with their local agencies to figure out where, where they can learn more, what they can do to better their or improve their trauma informed practices and things along those lines. But really just having a good partnership with us, which luckily Fond du Lac has and ASTOP are really great partners. While it is true that men can be sexually assaulted, the vast majority of sexual assault victims will be female. Very true. What specific role should cis males such as myself take beyond becoming an advocate? Oh my God, love this question. It's amazing, especially coming off of 424, which I don't know if people know, but it was a very, on social media, there were some people who were saying that they were going to make that National Rape Day. And that's something that white cis males, or just cis males in general, can definitely step up and use their privilege to say, hey, no, that's not okay. And beyond becoming an advocate, I would say just like when you're hanging out with your friends, or even if they're not your friends and you hear somebody making a joke out of sexual assault or rape or anything like that, just like a simple, hey, that's not okay. Because really just like changing that around, that thought process of, oh, it's okay for us to joke about how we treat women's bodies, and telling people that it's not okay is really going to change how we how society perceives sexual assault. Beyond that, if you see something suspicious, you have the privilege to step in. If some like things in social media have been like, a woman will go up to another woman who is being followed by a guy and say, hey, I've been looking for you all over the store, or whatever, even if they have no idea who each other are. Men can do that too. Just like let them know somehow somehow subtly in the conversation that you're not, going to do anything to harm them. You're just there to help them. And I'm sure that women would be interested in having that allyship. I see a raised hand.
Yeah, Leah, do you have any further questions? I have another question. What made you want to become an advocate?
I really just wanted to help people. I didn't know why or how or what I could do. I just knew that I wanted to help people and make an impact. Now looking back at it, my life has had I've had a few of my own experiences with sexual assaults, whether it's like with friends or family or things like that, and watching others go through it. And now that I'm in this world, I can really identify those things and realize like that is what pushed me to want to help people. But just having that passion of wanting to help people. What are some barriers that might be unique to victims or survivors who don't speak English? How can we advocate for more linguistic inclusion? Great question. I can talk for a very long time on this, so I'll try to be I'll try not to talk for too long. One of the biggest and most widespread barriers is honestly just that government and just general institutions don't have the same amount of access as they do for people who speak English. For example, I mentioned that courts oftentimes will say that the client themselves has to ask for an interpreter. So how would they know that they have to ask for an interpreter if they can't find that information in their language? And how would they ask for an interpreter if they don't have an interpreter to tell the person who doesn't speak their language that they want one? If I spoke in Spanish to you saying I want an interpreter, you wouldn't be able to do anything with that information because you wouldn't understand what I'm saying. So that's like a really big thing that we've come across, and it's difficult to make sure that the non-English speaking populations are being heard because they don't have a safe place to speak and use their voice and tell us what's wrong. I know from looking at statistics, a lot of minorities, a lot of people who don't speak English aren't reporting as much as their English counterparts. And that's a really big issue because the work that we're doing, it really changes our clients' experiences in the law enforcement and justice systems. So when we're not able to do the same for the Spanish speaking clients that we have or any other people who don't speak English, that means that they're not able to get their rights in the first place. And then they already have less privilege than the average English speaking person. So they're less likely to be heard and listened to already. And then we're also just not reaching them because they're afraid to tell their story because they don't have a place to do so. So that's just the second question is, how can we advocate for more linguistic inclusion? Really just, if you have an opportunity, if you're in an office of any sort, just try to find a way to incorporate your whatever resources that you have in another language. You can start by online, there are these big pages that say, do you need an interpreter, but it says it in like 150 different languages or something like that. So just having that printout to show people that you're open to figuring out and working with them. Like you can figure out getting them the resources that you have. You can figure out how to get them an interpreter. That's what that means to them, So just having that is showing them that you're open to working with them. Beyond that, if you have the opportunity to get your resources translated, that'd be amazing. But just by showing them that you're welcoming to them is a big first step.
Devin?
Can I go? Sorry. So I'm going to apologize first off for staying on the topic of men. Just given that I'm a cis male, I consistently find myself being the only male in the room advocating for allyship. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to mention that there is a culture of masculinity that shuns emotional advocacy for one another, mm-hmm. both for males, females, any gender. I often find myself feeling discouraged from speaking on issues that I find to be inappropriate on social media for fear of coming off as non-masculine. What are some ways that cis male allies can take to change this culture of toxic masculinity? And are there any organizations of men that advocate for sexual misconduct prevention?
Not sure if there are specific organizations of only men. However, I'm sure that our prevention educator would love to work with you on creating something that we can work with. And I can definitely get back to you with more information on like specific organizations if you're interested. And then for the rest of it, how to come off as still masculine, but still protecting women, is the way that I'm choosing to phrase that, for lack of better words. I would say the best way to do that is, there's a lot of graphics out there that say like, it's masculine not to like force yourself onto somebody, or I use my masculinity to speak out for women instead of against women. There are things like that you could post on your own social media just to show that like you are an ally and you don't tolerate that type of conversation. Other things that you could do would just to educate others, would just be to educate others, I would say. Consent, I like that. Consent is attractive. It's a great quote. And just, yeah, like educating others and showing them that, you know, it is important to ask for consent or whatever it may be. It looks like Alicia just posted an organization, which is amazing. We'll definitely have to take a look at that ourselves too. Because as a cis male, you do have the opportunity to educate others and have your voice be listened to more than, for example, mine. And so when you're sharing something, like if you shared the link to this video somewhere, there's a higher possibility that your post would be listened to than mine would, just because you are a cis male. So using that privilege to get information out there, I think would be a good way to do it. And you could do it casually by being like, oh, hey, saw this, thought it was interesting. And that might feel a little bit more masculine for you than, wow, sexual assault is really an important topic and we need to protect women and other sexual assault survivors. You know, I don't know, whatever feels best for you, but yeah.
Oh, I just realized I left my mic on. I apologize. I mean, I suppose what I would say in response to that is that there certainly does need to be a change in culture and increasement of education. I always say that education is the greatest tool against combating negative stereotypes and as well as negative behaviors. So I appreciate the input.
Yeah, and I appreciate your allyship.
Oh, also thank you, Alicia, for sharing that. I actually have not. Oh, and thank you again, Alicia. I will definitely be checking out those links.
Going back to when you were talking about the language barrier, I work in healthcare. I'm a CNA, so I understand the barriers that exist. We have like translator phones, but I'm not sure how effective they are because the nurses usually use them. And then we have, I forgot the name of it. It's like a little TV. We only have one for our entire hospital.
Yeah.
Which isn't really efficient when our populations, you know, there's so many barriers that I feel like there needs to be more. And I heard that there was an app, like a new app on the iPhone that's a translator, but I don't know if you've heard of that. I was just wondering if you know. You haven't?
No, I haven't heard of it, but I'm curious if how much.
I want to know if it's accurate. Yeah.
Well, so the issue with like translators and being accurate is you just want to make sure that they're certified. That is the biggest thing, because if they're not certified, then they haven't gone to through the training that they are supposed to go through. And if they are certified, then they should be translating everything directly, no summarizations, and no like changing things to a suggestion. For example, if you say like, oh, you could go through door A or you could go through door B, they shouldn't say, oh yeah, go through door B, but you also have door A. And they should just be saying exactly what you're saying. And like you said, like it's really difficult to know if things are accurate unless you have a third party there. And like, who do you trust to tell you that it's accurate? So that's something that we've like come across a couple of times when making appointments or something like that. We'll have interpreters just say, oh yeah, they have a couple of questions about court, when the client talks for like a solid 30 seconds. And we're like, so we missed that whole part of the conversation. And we have no idea what they said. So can you like tell us what they actually said? And they're just like, oh yeah, they wanted to talk about court, and just leave it kind of at that. So it's, yeah, like you said, it's really difficult to know unless you know some of the language, but that's not, we can't expect everybody in the world to learn all of these languages.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions?
Since ASTOP serves Fond du Lac County, what challenges do you see about sexual assault prevention or facing victim survivors in Fond du Lac County? So just so everybody's aware, we also serve Green Lake and Waushara counties. But talking about Fond du Lac County specifically, we actually have a lot of opportunities to go out and do prevention work with schools. Our prevention educator is doing presentations all the time and always seems to be, running out to go do this presentation or that presentation. But challenges, I would say we do have optional education series that we do every now and then. And those definitely aren't as attended as we would like. So just in general, getting networking out a little bit more so that we can share all of these education series and making sure that people have access to those would be amazing, just so that we have the opportunity to reach more of the community. For victims specifically in Fond du Lac County, I would say it depends. I wouldn't say it's specific to Fond du Lac County. I would just go back to what I was talking about way at the beginning of this, where sometimes they're not believed. Sometimes when they tell somebody, they have these faces full of disgust or discomfort. And it just makes it difficult for them to continue looking to receive more services, essentially. If they tell one person and they're like, oh, well, that's not true, or that's really uncomfortable, why did you tell me that? Then they're not going to want to tell anybody else. So I think that going to those education webinars and things like that we have would really help with the reaction and just general community awareness. Why do you think there is a large segment of the population of America that when a sexual assault survivor speaks out that they're not telling the truth or are trying to make a cash grab? Probably media, TV, media, things along those lines. You don't often see somebody in the news who actually got sexually assaulted, because that's not news. That's not anything new. But when somebody claims that they were sexually assaulted and it's not true, then that, makes headlines, especially if it's somebody who's famous, which is much more likely that would happen to. Why would somebody just accuse some random person of sexually assaulting them? Other reasons are people who sexually assault are very good at manipulating typically. They tend to be people who want power and control, and because of that, they're a little bit more practiced at being charming and having people believe them. And then lastly, because it's women, the majority of people who are sexually assaulted are women. And because of that, when, like I said earlier, when we speak up, we don't get believed as often as our male counterparts would be. Especially if you're a woman of color, which there are a ton of women of color who get sexually assaulted as well. Yeah, victim blaming is a big thing. You know, things like, oh, well, if she wasn't wearing that, or maybe if he hadn't had that many drinks, or things like that. And, you know, if somebody gets assaulted physically, like if they get mugged or beaten up outside of a club because they're drunk or whatever, nobody's going to say that it was their fault. But we do that with sexual assault. Green Lake and Washara counties are more rural, correct? What challenges do you see facing victims, survivors in rural versus urban areas? I would definitely say that there's a big difference in the language opportunities in the rural areas versus the urban areas. So the challenges that I mentioned before were more prevalent in Green Lake and Washara counties. And in Fond du Lac, we see a lot of I would be surprised if I were to see those challenges happen and see people pushing back against not wanting to have interpreters or wanting me to interpret or things along those lines. Unfortunately, Green Lake and Washara are also where a large amount of the Hispanic population live. So that does make everything a little bit harder. And then other than that, I think one of the biggest barriers in Green Lake and Washara are that they're so small that everybody knows everyone else. So I've had a few clients who didn't want to report or share their story because they were afraid that, you know, other people would find out just by them reporting because, you know, the police officers know everybody and they, you know, just everybody knows everybody. Or when they report, then we'll have police officers or the attorneys or things like that say like, oh yeah, you know, I've known you since you were a kid, and using that connection, which is a great connection to have, but it could make a victim a little bit more uncomfortable to tell, you know, the attorney or the police officers their story if they think that it's going to affect how they view them from when they knew them when they were a kid. Why is there a large backlog of untested rape kits in America? So one part of that is you can save, at least in Wisconsin, is mainly what I can speak to, but you can have your rape kit. We call them forensic examination kits. You can save those for up to 10 years after your assault if you don't get it tested right away. So if you go and you have your SAAM exam and you tell them, I don't know if I want to report, just get the kit, but don't test it, then they will hold on to it and they won't destroy it. So, but they also won't test it until you ask them to test it. So that's part of it, is that there's just a ton that are floating in limbo, essentially. And then the other part is that there was a large push a while ago to start testing them, but all of those kits from before we got that push were going untested. The reasoning behind that I can't really speak to. I wasn't working then, nor can I speak to the people who were testing those kits. But definitely just now they're getting tested and it's taking a while because there's a ton to test. Why do you think that people victim blame when it comes to sexual assaults? Because it's easier than believing and supporting the victim. If they don't have, if it was their fault, then they have to fix it. fix. But, you know, if it's something that happened to them, then people are supposed to be compassionate and feel bad for them. But that's a very difficult thing to do when you're just an average person. I'm trained in it, so I'd like to say I'm pretty good at it. But the average person, you know, doesn't know how to do that without also taking in that trauma themselves, which isn't something that they're expected to do, you know, but they would much rather have it be that person's burden than feel bad about it. And that's just psychology, in my opinion. And this is all opinion. So the next question, do you find that there could be a large group of men that this could be happening to that goes unnoticed due to society's views, saying that it could not or does not happen to men? Individuals who feel like they might not be taken seriously or fear of being emasculated coming forward, or not seeing as a man due to coming forward. I apologize. You're good. So yeah, it's totally there's. So what I like to say is the stats that we have now are just what's being reported. We have no idea how many sexual assaults are out there that people aren't reporting. We can make estimates, we can guess, but we can't make any guarantees about whether that's accurate or not. I would say that even with the things that are going unreported, it's probably likely that there are more women that are being assaulted, but the number of men that are being assaulted would definitely increase if we looked at all of the people who were sexually assaulted ever, whether or not they reported. Men often don't report because they fear being emasculated, just as you said, and the response that they get back is a little bit different from women. You know, they are going to be told like, oh, well, you're strong. Why didn't you fight back? If it's a woman, and they'll say, well, you know, it was just a woman. She's probably smaller than you. Why didn't you fight back? Why couldn't you have stopped her? And I'll get more on that in a second. And then the second thing that men will often see is if it's a man, oh, well, then you must be gay. You must be asking for it. You must be gay. Why would you have let it happen to you? So both of these things like go on the premise that men are asking for it or they want it or whatever, which is the same thing that I mentioned earlier with women. People who are assaulted are never asking for it. They never want it. And because of the 4 different trauma responses, it makes it very difficult for people to fight back. So there's flight and fight, freeze, and fawn. The first 3 are pretty easy to understand. Fight, flight, freeze. You know, you either fight back, you run away, you freeze up and go still, or fawn, which means that you just listen to whatever they say. You know, they could tell you to jump off a bridge and you'll be like, oh, well, I guess, you know, because you think that doing whatever they ask you to do will get you into less harm than if you don't do what they ask you to do. So essentially, even if a man could fight off a woman from sexually assaulting him, he could slip into any one of those 4 trauma responses, specifically freeze or fawn, and just lay there frozen or just do whatever she tells him to because he thinks that he'll get hurt otherwise. So those are just a couple of the reasons that the responses that men get are incorrect. But yes, there's definitely a group of men that just don't report, don't really come up on our radar because they're afraid of reporting. How might students on our Fond du Lac campus and other campuses connect with or get involved with ASTOP? What kind of education work does ASTOP do with college-age students? We're working to try to get some more like volunteer opportunities that are more geared at college students, but even without those, you can definitely sign up to do volunteer hours with us, and those will go for whatever volunteer hours you need for extracurricular activities or college or whatever. So that's definitely a big help for us. And then I think it's an amazing opportunity. You get some really great one-on-one time with victims and survivors who call our crisis line, and then they just need somebody to help them feel a little bit more grounded. And then you also get the opportunity to go to SAAM exams or police department reports. And I think that that's just so humbling to be there for and be the person that is with you, be the person that's with a survivor during that time. I think it's so humbling and powerful. So definitely, if you're interested in doing that, you can email us. I will put our email in the chat. Okay. How has COVID-19 impacted your role, and what impacts has COVID-19 had on victims and survivors? The biggest impact that we saw is that our volunteers no longer wanted to go in person to different reports or requests for accompaniment. And that's just not ideal for our victims and clients, just because support is best had in person. But beyond that, there haven't been a ton of barriers specific to COVID, just because we were very intent on making sure that our services went on through COVID. We still wear our masks in the office. I'm just in my private office right now, so I don't have to. And we ask that our clients wear masks and everything like that. There might be some unseen barriers, like people not wanting to come to our office because they're worried about getting COVID, or people being less likely to report, or even possibly being turned away at hospitals if they aren't clear about what they're looking for. But we haven't really seen enough of that to see it as a barrier, at least in our eyes, yet.
And then Alicia just put down an event that we have tonight, the documentary on nerves at 6 p.m.
Yeah, and our prevention educator is going to be in on that. I've mentioned her a couple of times. She's a great resource.
Cool. Something I was wondering is, do advocates ever have to testify in court, like sexual assault nurse examiners? Or yeah.
No, we don't. So I was nodding as in, like, I understand your question. So very, very, very infrequently do we ever have to testify about anything. I have a trial coming up that I was actually worried about needing to have to testify, just because I was there for a good portion of her SAAM exam and things along those lines. And the things that I experienced could also be used in court as evidence, but there's always somebody else there. You know, SAAM exam nurses, they would testify instead in that moment. We have privilege and confidentiality. So people not in our world, that means that essentially, if you think of lawyer-client privilege, it's pretty similar. And then confidentiality is just confidentiality. We don't tell anybody anything that you bring to us. And the only time that we would have to do something like that is if we get subpoenaed, but we almost never get subpoenaed because we do have that privilege and confidentiality. And I'm pretty sure that we would be able to say, I cannot share that to a lot of the questions anyway.
Does anyone else have any questions? I have one. Did you have to get any like certifications or like education to become an advocate?
Yeah, so there's the WCASA is what we call it, Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And they have a sexual assault victim advocate school called SAVIS, or SAVIS, however you want to pronounce it. And that was about 40 hours online. They usually do like a weekend in person, but online they stretched it out, it seems like. And that they went over a ton of different things about being an advocate and how, you know, the different things that they recommend and policies for Wisconsin specific statutes or things along those lines. And so that was super helpful. And then beyond that, we have our own trainings that we do here as well.
And then it looks like Alicia also put the evaluation once this is complete, and then Wacasa's website.
I'm glad that you guys enjoyed the discussion. I really loved a lot of your questions. They were amazing questions.
Do you have anything else you want to share with us, Sydney?
I don't think so.
I think you did a really good job. Everything you shared was super interesting.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm.